Hi everyone, welcome to ArtsFest Online and to this afternoon's HoPIN webinar, Chapbook Illustrations. Presentations will be from Dr. Leo De Freitas and Dr. Giles Burgle. The event will be chaired by Dr. John Hinks, co-director of the Centre for Printing History and Culture. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. A reminder that this event is being recorded. It is a public platform, so please do not share any confidential information. And if you do have any questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A box and John will go through them at the end of the presentations. So welcome everyone, and over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Claire. And thank you again to Wolverhampton for hosting this event, as always. Yeah, and welcome to everyone who's joining us from all around the world, which is great. I think this may be our most international audience so far for a HoPIN event, and we're up to about 100 participants now, and there may be more people joining in the next few minutes, I think. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this one particularly because I've worked on chapbooks myself, and it's a very interesting topic. And I know both of the presenters, Leo and Giles. And we're going to have Leo first. Leo is going to talk to us about early chapbook illustrations of Robinson Crusoe. Leo's worked a lot on chapbooks and on illustration. He's lectured in a number of universities on the history of British illustration from as far back as 1500 up to date, more or less. And he's curated a number of exhibitions. So who better to talk to us about chapbook illustrations of Robinson Crusoe? Okay, over to you, Leo. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Right. Well, good evening, everyone. Chapbook literature in general was not a genre to encourage original imagery. The illustrative content is often taken from previous texts and used with or without discrimination. The roots of the Crusoe chapbook images, however, are slightly different, and these origins and subsequent modifications are the subject of this short talk. An unstressed but sought-for outcome of this short overview is the encouragement to consider chapbook illustration more critically than perhaps is usual, with the aspiration to better understand the visual culture that was readily available to the people. It must be emphasized from the outset that it was not the full 3-volume experiences of Robinson Crusoe that normally interested chapbook printer publishers in the 18th century. Volume 1, the adventurous experiences as a lonely but resourceful castaway, held the whole meaningful experience and thus entertaining value for the intended readership, and only occasionally did aspects of Volume 2 appear, his return to the island and further travels. I believe Volume 3 does not appear at all as a chapbook. The genesis for the early chapbook illustration to Robinson Crusoe can be traced from the solitary etched frontispiece to William Taylor's first edition of 1719, through the 6 anonymous copperplates to the illustrated 6th edition of 1722, to finally the abridged popular edition, also of 1722, with its more numerous metal cuts, printed and published by Edward Midwinter. Agreeably, the constant image for all the early books and the most long-lived in influence for the 18th century reader is also the first full-figure study of the protagonist, the figure of the eponymous hero in the frontispiece to the 1719 edition. By following its fortunes for a short while, we'll arrive at the chapbook version from where we can engage a little more widely with the popular depiction of the Crusoe story. Etched and engraved by John Clark and John Pine, the frontispiece to the first publication of Defoe's novel instantly became the archetype of the redoubtable survivor of shipwreck. The year following, Bernard Picard, a French engraver living and working in Amsterdam, produced a more appropriate interpretation of Crusoe, closely based on the London print, but subtly and significantly different. 3 years later, and the first single-volume abridged version of the original story, published and generously illustrated by Edward Midwinter, continues the depiction of the iconic figure. Casual anonymity about who actually drew and designed these early Crusoe images continues with this important popular edition. But the significance now is that a shift in the illustrative process has been made from the work of the artist in his studio to that, in all likelihood, of the artisan in his workshop. While the frontispiece imitation of the original design is a creditable effort in a less sophisticated engraving process, the metal cut, the extensive textual illustrations are clearly from the world of popular printing and publishing. But where might the designs for these textual illustrations for this popular edition have come from? Upon this question rests my later argument that many chapbook images ultimately derive from this popular work of 1722. And if this is so, then their origins are of singular import. Midwinter's first source for his imagery, in addition to the frontispiece, are the unsigned copperplate illustrations from Taylor's 1722 edition. In these plates, he found several likely subjects for his own work and liberally helped himself to their ideas and designs. An example, a chosen plate from Taylor's edition is this panoptic narrative where multiple scenes and actions are shown in a single design. The legend to the print informs us that what we are witnessing is the moment Crusoe and his boy Zuri on the coast of Guinea shoot a lion. However, it is this and more. Two distinct episodes in the story are combined in this single image, and if the result is not unreadable, a narrative logic is nonetheless compromised. In the bottom half of the image, we see Crusoe firing from his boat at the lion, whereas in the top illustration, we see a later episode where Crusoe has fired on leopards, attacking a group of natives. Midwinter took the decision to adopt but separate these two sequences and make the distinction that the text demands. As he exploited some of the original illustrations for his use, some designs he adapted near enough wholesale, where others he merely clipped a section for use. Now, I've been implying that all the above design decisions were Midwinter's, but as he was not known as a draftsman of any sort, it was likely he relied on compositional judgments from an unknown advisor, whilst perhaps keeping all editorial decisions on what to illustrate with himself. It would be an insight for us to know what the actual working practices were between publisher, editor or art director, and illustrator. But I fear this is a forlorn hope at the present. As a noteworthy technical aside, the process used in Midwinter's illustrated edition has provided a controversial topic for historians of print. Whilst looking like woodcuts, the illustrations are considered, and I concur, in fact, metal cuts. There is no space here to review the argument, and it must suffice to stress the salient point that the aesthetic informing the images is that associated with street literature and not that of the artist engraver's studio. There is perhaps one further question we might wish to satisfy ourselves on, and that is why, if the book was to sell at 1 shilling, a simple graphic reproductive process was chosen. Couldn't some more refined process have been afforded and employed? Midwinter might courteously be described as an omnivorous printer publisher, with fingers in various pies, from regular book printing to varieties of street literature. This gave him valuable experience in the economics of printing and publishing when it came to devising his Robinson Crusoe project. And in this, he would have been more than helpfully aided by his employee and advocate of cheap illustrated literature, Thomas Gent, who may also have been the unknown advisor in the background. Again, there's not the time to argue the case for both men as pioneering entrepreneurs of such publishing, but it can be noted that they were intimately familiar with illustration for hoi polloi literature and would have favored its economic and technical advantages over that of the more sophisticated processes. So, a number of Midwinter's illustrations were indebted to Taylor's illustrated edition. This rather long but necessary preamble positions us to consider the transference of ideas and images from the book publishers' editions to the chapbook printers' products. The Life of Robinson Crusoe of York, Mariner, printed and sold in Aldermary Churchyard, Bow Lane, London, is an undated 24-page booklet, 150mm high by 85mm wide, and here considered to be one of the earliest, if not the earliest, of Crusoe chapbooks of this physical character. Both the British Library and the Bodleian catalogues give the date of this chapbook as between 1740 and 1770, which is a little less than helpful. The address, however, identifies the publishers as the prominent producers of street literature, William and Clewar Dicey, and if correct, the probable dating of their chapbook can be more accurately identified. One is listed in a catalogue of maps printed and sold by William and Clewar Dicey, published in 1754. This date as a publication date for the chapbook has therefore been chosen, but future research may uncover later dates or earlier dates. Such tremendous abbreviation of the original novel meant that the reduction in number and size of pages could not possibly hold the number of illustrations of the abridged 1722 midwinter edition, and their place is taken by 9 textual images plus a cover image. It is with this cover illustration that we are bound to begin, because the emblematic and evocative image of the hero appears again, even if pictorially demeaned. The redrawn figure of Crusoe is almost conspicuously the casualty of the move to the realm of the chapbook, and the simpler production method, the woodcut, in the hands of tradesmen, did nothing to ameliorate these changes. The iconic figure is a poor cipher of either of its originals. The elements of the successful archetype's design are present, excepting the palisade, but any attempt at a close copy is lost in the feebly drawn caricature of the hero and his world. From the partial reversal of the composition to the inexplicably becalmed ship and the clumsy representation of the vessel's mast, through the poor differences made between human skin and animal hide, to the scrubby bush at Crusoe's feet, the hand that drew and possibly cut this image was self-evidently untutored. Tempted to excuse these criticisms, the tolerant might be moved to plead the difference in scale. The chapbook image was 65mm high by 65mm wide, compared to the 1722 metal cut, which was approximately twice as tall by 81mm wide. But equally reduced, yet markedly more interesting renderings exist to allow such a defense. A particular criticism of the image resides in a comparison of the face of the hero, a rather doe-eyed, if not vacant, expression, contrasting heavily with the originals. Despite their name and repute in chapbook production, the Diceys were not over-concerned with the quality of their illustration. A subjective impression is that their works are generally designed to a template, and their illustrations supplied by a hand in want of talent. This criticism embraces their Crusoe images. Of the 5 chapbook woodcuts sharing moments from the midwinter edition and more or less derivative of them, the following are standard examples. This uninspired depiction of Crusoe escaping with his life from the wrecking of the ship is lacking everything a pictorial excited illustration could offer. Despite the prompt of the text, a man appears to walk out of the sea, helping himself up onto a barren and exotic isle, note the stylized palm tree, by the aid of convenient rocks. The potential of this scene was recognized and exploited by Midwinter as a dramatic moment not to be missed. Neither image could hope to compete with the earlier intaglio illustration of the same dramatic moment by Bernard Picard. Nonetheless, the Dicey version is particularly weak, especially as having a relatively spirited version to follow. One more example, and this time in favor of Dicey. The first illustrated version of the story carried no illustration of a scene repeated. The depiction of the castaway inventing a system to remind him of the passage of days. Here, in this dicey version, we find in the interpretation of space and perspective an improvement on the Midwinter original. Midwinter's tilted up perspective in order to convey the passage of the creek makes for uncomfortable pictorial decoding. The dicey copy rectifies this error and introduces Crusoe's hilltop home, complete with ladder, to ginger up an otherwise banal depiction of an important aspect of the story, the passing of time. Significantly, 1754 was also the date when William Hogarth, as a part of his crusade to improve British art, was to satirize false perspective, surely a comment on the prevalence of this pictorial malaise, not limited to the cheap illustration of street literature. It must be noted that not all of the dicey woodcuts were derived from the earlier copperplate originals. A third are clearly newly created or possibly borrowed from the printer's trade. I Made a Raft, an understandably popular subject for future editions of both book and chapbook, was unaccountably overlooked by Midwinter, an otherwise shrewd judge of the pertinent moment and its pictorial depiction. Although the subject had been embraced by the copperplate design of 1722, it is likely as the woodcut is almost a replica of the landing scene, with the addition of a figure, equipment, and the raft, that it was cut and possibly designed specifically for the chapbook by the anonymous woodcutter. An image that has all the characteristics of a make-weight, probably from the printer's store of stock blocks. I was resolved Friday's father and the Portuguese should go over in one of the canoes we had taken, could be an illustration to any text requiring an image of men in a boat. Indeed, in subsequent printings, Dyson employed a number of similar but different generic blocks for his scene. Collectively, the 9 textual illustrations plus the cover image of the dicey chapbook are unimpressive as illustrative art, and on these terms, the art side, deserving perhaps of the opprobrium of the book lover or connoisseur. In the 19th century and down to the present, the more magnanimous have been content to describe these images as quaint. However, the historian of the popular printed image, and especially of street literature, is required to do more than measure them up against examples of excellence or extol their naive and simplistic appeal, and to ask why they look like they do. There is no question that Georgians would have accepted Horace Walpole's description of 18th century English woodcuts as slovenly stamps. Whether he had in mind the pictorial art of street literature, we do not know, but it is likely. They were largely poor examples of woodblock printmaking around mid-century, and Thomas Bewick's innovative work was still some 20 or so years off. And yet, there were examples of woodcut prints of the time that show available skill in the process, especially for book ornaments and newspaper headpieces and occasional illustrations. The work of Thomas Davies, Francis Hoffman, William Pennock can testify to this skill. And then there was John Bell's exceptional cutting of Hogarth's 4 Stages of Cruelty in the 1750s, together with this anonymous illustration from the Oxford Sausage of 1746, demonstrating more than competent skills in cutting and engraving. Why these abilities were not shared with nor filtered down to the chapbooks in any measurable manner is an interesting question. The professional illustrator, as a visual artist able to make a living from drawing for the printed page, appears in Britain at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th. Before then, bookseller publishers called upon the art-trained engravers in their studios to provide the grand intaglio plates for prestigious books. And at the other end of the spectrum, printers would use the services of woodcutters for the relief block ornaments, flowers, and occasional figures. But who were these woodcutters? In the 1747 General Description of Trades, woodcutting was described as akin to engraving and not harder work and easier to be learnt and performed, therefore fit for spare, acute lads who have some notion of drawing. And revealingly, he may be a master with very few tools and a little pear tree or boxwood. Now, what sort of character a spare, acute lad might have been, I'm not entirely sure, but the sense is an able, but not particularly gifted artisan. With some notion of drawing, equipped with a set of basic tools, it is likely that the provision of images for street literature was in the hands of these graphic artists of a second order. Certainly, Dicey's Robinson Crusoe, as indeed Midwinter's images too, exhibits all the limitations implied in the figure of the shadowy, miscellaneous worker for the printer. Now, if attempting the difficult question of what reception these chapbook Crusoe illustrations might have had and what importance we might ascribe to them, it is helpful to combine two observations: who was reading both text and images, and how the illustrations might have been used in the unfolding of the story. The reading publics for chapbooks were to be found in the meanest cottage, as also the sitting room we sought. Public arenas too were locations for the selling and dissemination of the little books and for their declamation. The mid-18th century chapbook Robinson Crusoe, I imagine, having been the choice of young adolescent males, being not yet the children's book it was destined to become. It does not read as a gender-neutral tale. It preoccupies itself with masculine concerns such as hunting, fighting, husbandry, manufacturing, and even colonial-like administrative skills. Now, none of this precludes females, of course. The stories of resourceful women who went to sea with or in search of a loved one is evidence of that. But the abridged Crusoe reads almost as a vade-mecum of the necessary skills for the type of physical survival usually reserved for the common man. Women, apart from Crusoe's long-suffering mother, who is dead on his return, his wife, who dies after giving birth to their 2 sons and a daughter, and towards the end of the tale, the English women he was going to introduce into the island for the necessary purposes of a new colony, are the only references made to them. And the abbreviated narrative, it might reasonably be assumed, would have had limited appeal to maturing girls and young women. It's a boys' book, and the images feed an appetite for adventure, daring do, and success, and inform the text at appropriate moments. It has been assumed that the little books were not only read by their purchasers, but also read aloud to others, both children and adults. If, for our instructional purposes, one separates the illustrations from the letterpress and combines them into a storyboard, one can see how they present the narrative in a pictorial manner. Like the explanation of Bible stories to the illiterate through the medium of stained glass windows, once acquainted with the story of Robinson Crusoe, his trials, tribulations, and ultimate good end, any disadvantaged reader of the tale could reconstruct and retell the narrative through the agency of the woodcuts. As such, the images would be functioning as good illustrations in the sense that Thomas Gent would have defended them. No matter how poorly designed, images would do very well if they acted as aid memoirs to the viewer and allow the retelling of the tale from prompts the illustrations gave. Now, I've come across no such contemporary storyboards so far, but of course, they were not long in coming and have continued down to the present. The 3-volume Robinson Crusoe entered the canon of English literature surprisingly quickly, and within the tale, the importance of fortune, perseverance, resourcefulness, foresight, risk, skill, and ambition as attributes with which to successfully face the world resonated through a newly motivated society. Lessons, both practical and moral, were in good supply in the storytelling, and the penny chapbook played its part in the telling and dissemination of the tale to the lower areas of society. Crusoe's difficulties and setbacks might be set in an exotic locale, but many of these trials and tribulations could translate or transfer into the world of the hoi polloi who read and listened to the little book in Britain. Finally, it needs to be observed that the chapbook Robinson Crusoe was atypical in being one of the very few 18th century chapbooks to have been made of a contemporary literary text, a text that is arguably a proto-novel or a novel per se. Gulliver's Travels was also turned into a chapbook, as was Moll Flanders, but neither so successfully as Robinson Crusoe. Illustration from the start was important, and the expensive copperplate images, it has been argued, provided the source of ideas for the abridged edition and ensuing numerous chapbooks intended for the common reader. A fuller account of the chapbook's treatment of the novel, especially through its illustrations from the 18th century through to the 19th centuries, suggests an interesting and worthwhile study. Thank you for listening. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Leo. Wait a minute. Can you see me? Yes, you can see me, for what that's worth. Yeah, that was great. Thank you. That was a really entertaining and interesting tour with some wonderful illustrations. And I'm looking forward to discussion at the end. Just to remind everybody, especially those who've come in since we started, we want questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, please. And we'll do those after the second speaker has performed. We'll have the last up to half an hour maybe for questions and discussion at the end. So thanks again to Leo, and on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Giles Burgle. Giles has been working on chapbooks and on related subjects, various aspects of book history, for some years now. And last year and earlier this year, he was the first Research Fellow in Digital Scholarship at the National Library of Scotland, which gave him an opportunity of doing some very interesting work. His day job, as it were, is Senior Researcher in Digital Humanities at the University of Oxford. Giles is going to talk to us about how to teach computers to find, match and classify woodcuts. Giles, welcome, over to you.
Thanks, John. Thank you also to Claire for hosting at the University of Wolverhampton, and also Eleanor for running the tech, and for my fellow speaker. I think the two papers are going to have lots to say to each other, hopefully, but we'll see. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully people can see that. Yeah. Okay, cool. As well as thanking, I have other thanks to record to my colleagues at Visual Geometry Group in Engineering Science at Oxford. Some of them, their contributions will, I think, become clear during this talk. And I also want to thank the National Library of Scotland, who, as John said, were kind enough to give me a fellowship to work on one of the collections hosted in their Data Foundry site, which is a digital humanist paradise in terms of the data that it makes conveniently available for computational analysis, all kinds of data sets. These visually don't do justice actually to the range of materials that they make available, but you can see just at the bottom of this grid, chapbooks printed in Scotland, which is going to be the subject of this talk and is the subject of my analysis. It contains 3,000 digitized chapbooks, images, XML, text, metadata, and I was also able to make use of the authority list that the library has built up over decades of research, involving also the work of the Scottish Book Trade Index, which incorporates a chapbook, Scottish Chapbook Printers Index. So I kind of labor this point a bit about the kind of curation and the metadata, if you like, associating what's going to be a talk largely on images, because I worry a bit about a digital humanities practice that's simply a smash and grab, a raid on data that doesn't really think carefully enough about where that data comes from. So the way that data is shaped and presented by practices of curation and publication, and the labor, or sometimes the invisible labor that goes into that curation and publication, is going to be something I'll come back to in various forms. Here is one of the chapbooks in that data set, available through the NLS's very nice IIIF-based image gallery, and you can see immediately that there is an illustration in this chapbook, but not all pages are illustrated. I'll come now to a kind of commonplace statement made about chapbook illustration. I can kind of hear almost Leo grinding his teeth to some extent about this. He and I have talked a bit about some of the cliches people use to describe chapbooks, and this is a good and useful publication about Scottish chapbooks. There's a couple of assumptions in it that I'm keen to investigate in this research. So this statement has two parts to it, really. I mean, that chapbook illustrations, woodcut illustrations, usually serving this purpose, are typically fairly crudely executed and make only an indirect allusion, if any at all, to the content. They're more often kind of stock illustrations, stock blocks. So my purpose in the research is to investigate some of these claims using the help of some tools developed by myself and colleagues in visual geometry. And there are three tasks we set ourselves. Here they are with the titles of some of the tools which I'll be demonstrating and which are available for reuse and for critique, perhaps. The tasks are to find illustrated pages using object detection. Tools for that are a thing called Efficient Det and DGG Lisa. Next, we wanted to match and group the illustrations per block. So we wanted to identify illustrations coming from a specific block, which is not always straightforward, as I'll show, and we used a tool called DGG Vice for that purpose. Next, and rather more experimentally, we wanted to classify the subject or content of the illustrations using a tool called DGG Vic. So I'll go through each of these tasks and show you how far we've got to. So first of all, finding the illustrated pages. For that, we use object detection, which is a common task in computer vision. The goal of it is to establish a bounding box, to predict a bounding box. These oblongs you can see on this image on the right, containing a specific class of objects, in this case, people, buses, and umbrellas. I mean, this is a common task with applications such as automated driving. And we're using, in this case, an object detection model called Efficient Det, which is trained on a large data set called COCO, Microsoft Common Objects in Common Objects in Context. A data set of 2.5 million labeled objects, so-called, although there are people and animals in this example, many other objects in over 300,000 images. This is obtained partly through automated recognition, automated detection, but bootstrapped by 70,000 worker hours of manual labeling by workers recruited via Amazon Mechanical Turk. And the paper that introduces Efficient Det, COCO, is unusually revealing about the process of obtaining this training data. And I think this is an important aspect of work in AI, that it's not just algorithms, it is algorithms, software, often a neural network. In our case, we're using Efficient Det, but AI also depends on rather large amounts of computing resources, such as available through large tech giants like Microsoft, storage, processing power. It's also heavily dependent on data sets. That AI, machine learning, has a voracious appetite for data, and we ourselves, VGG, kind of create, curate, and solicit large amounts of data, which is one of the reasons why we're keen to work with cultural heritage organizations, because they have typically large amounts of well-characterized data. And like I say, in our case, we're using Microsoft COCO. There's an important aspect to of human supervision as well, that so-called human-in-the-loop supervision of AI algorithms, of how they perform on specific training data, and feeding them data in the first place is an extremely important part of the pipeline. And all these elements, all these parts of the AI stack, I think, kind of increasingly call out for critical inquiry, and they also call out for investigation to what, in general terms, they're good for. Can we take, one of our research questions is, can we take one of these generic object detection models trained on all kinds of real-world objects and apply them to illustrations in printed books? So we went about this by retraining, by refining efficient det using a small sample of chapbook illustrations from the NLS data set. And you can see here a loop of a custom annotation tool we built for this project. My colleague Abhishek Dutta at VGG was responsible for this. And it gives us a very nice intuitive pipeline for kind of tagging things that we are interested in this case illustrations, which we then feed to our object detection algorithm. An overview of the process is, first of all, Abhishek manually annotated 337 chapbook pages in his annotation tool in Lisa. He trained efficient det on the above and applied it to 20,000 images. There are just over 43,000 in the data set, in the chapbooks data set. I then, also using Lisa, reviewed and revised 1,600, just over 1,600 predicted annotations, those bounding boxes, again in Lisa, which provides a kind of convenient interface to do that. We retrained, revised, repeated, and the output of that, the outcome of that is 3,864 illustrations, and the coordinates of those illustrations on 3,628 pages. And we also got a model, a so-called machine learning model, which is a refined version of efficient det that now knows about at least chapbook illustrations and maybe other kinds of illustrations. And we release that for reuse at this address here. Results are pretty positive, surprisingly so, actually, given the very generic nature of the model. So these are indeed chapbook illustrations for some value of illustration. Now, I did kind of face some sort of interesting questions about what I'm calling an illustration. Is an ornament an illustration? And in the end, I came down those graphical features that I thought are most characteristic of the chapbook format. But there is certainly grey area. And there are also slips. So there are one or two false negatives, things that weren't pictured, that at least were in the frame, at least could have been considered to be illustrations. These small details of the faces of cards aren't all picked up by the model. Quite a number of false positives are brought out by things like ink showing through the paper. And it would be hard to train these out. I mean, you can kind of imagine why the model thought, so to speak, that it was seeing an illustration. It was trivial, though, to weed these out using the Lisa toolchain. Slightly more interestingly, I mean, collectively, there was a kind of interesting kind of gallery of features of the page, or of the, if you like, the kind of the life of the book that are outside its kind of regular, average nature. So I delight in, like many book historians, delight in things like offsets, provenance stamps, dog ears. There are some holes in paper as well, and marginalia. Marginalia tend to throw off the detector, which would, I think, be of interest to scholars of marginalia, a popular topic these days. And you can imagine a scenario in which you retrained the detector specifically to find marginalia in large collections. The result, we got a browsable database of just the illustrated pages. And here you can see straight away, I have the ability to kind of get an overview using the NLS's very nice, well-controlled, authorized metadata of, for example, all the work of the publishing firm of J&M Robertson in Glasgow. And you can immediately see a common visual style, I think, certainly the kind of page layout and perhaps also the block cutting. And I'm not so sure that this is a crude woodcut myself. You may think so, but and perhaps, you know, what some chapbooks observers may have had in mind is more like the work of Thomas Johnson and Falkirk, one of a dynasty of important Falkirk chapbook printers, or John Moran in Edinburgh. But even so, I would argue that there's a kind of consistent visual branding that these illustrations provide, and certainly the recurrence of these blocks over many titles over a period of time produces a kind of an identity that's important to a location, a chapbook production, or a chapbook producer. And there are pragmatic considerations to bear in mind. So people may have come across this letter from Glasgow chapbook printer James Lunsden to the great Thomas Bewick, complaining that I received yesterday a number of cuts and coincided opinion with you that they're done in a very superior manner, but the style is very far from what I expressed to you, and I'm extremely sorry to say they're useless for the purpose intended. It would be useless to put them to press in the present state, but the coarseness of the paper we use would quite destroy them. And by that, I think, of course, he means not that they would damage the block, but that the paper is not up to the task of reproducing the fine lines of his innovative work with what we now call wood engraving. So I think we have to think of chapbook illustrations as optimized for a position in the market and for the materials through which they are transmitted. Okay, so moving on, our next task is to match and group the illustrations per block. And in this, we're inspired by some prior work. For example, the work of Ian Bevan is a snippet of an article from him, who observes chapbook blocks in evidence on, for example, a chapbook printed. You won't be able to see the imprint of the one on the left. This is a chapbook printed in Inverary in Scots Gaelic. On the right, the same block in use in a chapbook printed by Jane and Robinson in Glasgow. So this kind of work of hunting the block is an established practice in chapbook scholarship. We want to see if computer vision can improve that, can support that inquiry, which we do with by adapting a piece of software called Vice, VGG Image Search Engine. You can see it here in use, matching details of buildings in Oxford from, in this case, various angles, which gives you kind of a nice idea of its capabilities. So what we do with this technology is to extract these little red features here, these visual words, and match them in different images. And it works remarkably well. So I'm going to switch to a web browser and show you an operation. This is a demo that is hosted in Oxford. You can install the software on your own laptop as well, though. We make that available. And if I search, for example, using the metadata for, I'm going to browse first of all by imprint, and then I'm going to look for an imprint that is not very descriptive of the origin of the chapbook. So I'm going to look for an imprint that just says entered according to order, and that brings up chapbooks with that imprint. I'm going to select this item here, Tammy Lammy's Cure, which, according to the NLS metadata, we have a conjectured date of publication, 1790 ? And not much else. But I can go in and, using Vice, select a region of the chapbook, the illustration, and press search, and it runs that as a query against the 3,000 pages in the collection, and you come up with visual matches. And for example, I can see immediately a match between this item here, which has a Glasgow imprint. I have a flipbook view from which flips between one and the other. See the one on the right is being superimposed on one on the left, and I can see if the one on the right is in less good condition than the my original query image. I can go and look if I want at the features that are being matched, and there's an opportunity to sort of go through and see all of them. And most of all, perhaps for this purpose, I can go in and see the metadata for this item, in which I learned that it has a date of 1803, and therefore the date of 1790, conjectured date of 1790 for the other chapbook is plausible based on the condition of the block at the time of printing. And there's one or two other things that this demo provides as well, such as the ability to browse clusters of matched illustrations. So these are sets of 2 matching illustrations. I can go up to 19 or so and see again, this is the same subject as before, so perhaps just for the sake of showing something else. This provides therefore a convenient overview of the life, if you like, of a block, but it still requires, you know, a certain amount of kind of supervision to in some differentiate in some cases one block from another. Back to my presentation, and I've found things such as a chapbook, two chapbooks sharing the same block, one of which claims to be printed and entered in Newry in Northern Ireland, the other to be printed and sold in Edinburgh. I know this is a block that Ian Bevan knows quite well. I haven't had a chance to talk to him yet about what's going on here. I think probably what's happening here is it's printed in Newry rather than Edinburgh. However, we also have examples of blocks on the move, so blocks physically transported or handed down from, in this case, Aberdeen to Peterhead. We have quite good copies of blocks, which Feist doesn't always distinguish, sometimes usefully, sometimes not. In this case, if you look, for example, at the sword here, you can see that that's, or the plumes above there, that's, if you like, your smoking gun, that this kind of reasonably close copy is, though the more you see, the more differences you can extract. Reasonably close copy is not in fact the same block. And we have other bits and pieces, such as blocks, multiple blocks assembled in different configurations, different compositions. Now these tend to throw Vice because it does extract matching features, but again, to some extent usefully, in other extents, in another sense, complicating the inquiry. It doesn't, if you like, understand the kind of the context of matching features and distinguish between features that match in one context and are present in another. And so this allows it, for example, to find blocks that have been cut down. So in this example, I just play that video clip again, so you can see some of the background has been removed. And you can see blocks that have a rather long life in one place, apparently. This brings up the issue of stereotype. There's a quotation from John Ury, who's apprenticed to a Paisley chapbook printer, who describes the use of stereotype, possibly on some of these Paisley items. Certainly elsewhere in the NLS set, we see evidence of stereotype plates, and I was interested in Leo's example of metal cuts with fancy nail holes on one of them. Here we see nail holes on two plates in the collection, and this certainly kind of complicate the task of dating, if not necessarily other aspects of exploring the visual culture of these illustrations. Last and most experimentally, and in some ways at least satisfactorily from the point of view of discovery, but more interesting in terms of setting future research agendas, I did some experimentation with machine classification of the subject of the illustrations. And for that, I use a tool called VIC, VGG Image Classifier, or classification engine. And how this works is the classic, now classic method of simply feeding a lot of data to a neural network with labels and hoping, trusting that there is enough information in the compound of those images for the system to extract some features that reliably classify, for example, cats and dogs. So in this example here, it's a three-stage process. One is selecting a suitable neural network. Second, training that neural network by giving it no other information other than thousands, perhaps millions of images of cats or dogs, and a label that this is a cat and a dog. And it's absolutely up to the network, if you like, to kind of find features that allow it to refine its collective understanding of the thing that is present in those images. And then in the inference stage, you give it something it hasn't seen before and hope that it can find a cat or a dog. And this kind of method is what's driven advances in image recognition of the last 6 or 7 years in particular. So what I did was take some examples of things that I thought might be interesting to find in NLS chapbooks, So printers ornaments, I just grabbed these from various sources, Google Images and elsewhere. And what we got back was some things that are the usual, if you're familiar with machine classification, mélange of relevant and less relevant, and in some cases vastly irrelevant results. So above the top two rows, yes, some of them are certainly ornaments, or perhaps arguably ornaments. They might be more precisely called something else. Others are most assuredly not ornaments, but you can kind of see what the network is quote unquote thinking, or more pragmatically, what features were considered to be within scope. So this landscape here is not an ornament, but it does bear some similarity, particularly in the kind of rather reduced visual vocabulary of monochrome printing to some things that are. Further down here, this is most definitely not an ornament and is by any definition an off result, as are some of the things further down and so forth. And these are ranked in order of confidence. More positively, I could find sailing ships using a few examples, and you would expect that as a kind of relatively coherent and distinctive thing, that the system could find that. There are some null results at the bottom. So these images labeled as the little yellow triangles are warning signs, if you like. These are things that the network thinks are not sailing ships, and it's correct in those cases. Some of the things that it thinks are sailing ships, though, are incorrect. Likewise, portraits I had some success with, generically finding portraits, and in the context of this this panel, I couldn't resist looking for Robinson Crusoe, using some of the examples that Leo mentioned, although there's many more, and I'm eager to get my hands on them. So in this case, I gave the system these 5 examples of images of Robinson Crusoe, and what we got back was images of men waving pointy things. And although irrelevant, again, you can kind of see what the classifier was thinking. I did make an attempt to refine this a bit. So if I kind of click on this video here, you can see page 3 of my research results. So page 3 out of 78 did turn up an image which is indeed one of Crusoe. So I selected that. I asked to show me similar results. It came up with a couple more. I selected those as well, so I retrained using those examples. And we got one more, so I consider that a kind of a partial success. And really the kind of front line, I think, in this kind of image classification is the middle ground between finding specific instances, such as impressions of particular blocks, or finding general topics or objects in a broad range of contexts, such as ships. Finding visual influence or stylistically similar material, that seems to me the kind of interesting challenge for computer vision applied to art going forward. Okay, and here are some future research questions. So the block matching is not perfect. It is pretty good. The object detection, by the way, is extremely good. We're about to release some benchmarks showing that it's in excess of 95%, at least to the things that we are looking for, things that we asked it to return. As I hope I've indicated, the success of this exercise is highly dependent on the data that you have. Like I say, the kind of middle ground between classification and matching, can we identify visual traditions, directly copy blocks? Leo had some lovely examples of how the kind of stock figure of Crusoe had been copied and transformed. This kind of matching, or this kind of tracing work, which humans can do intuitively and can get better at, computers at the moment are very poor at. Likewise, can we group illustrations by other stylistic criteria, such as the maker, who we think is the maker? And perhaps most interesting in relation to the history of printing and the print trades, you can't help thinking, as you're carrying out these algorithmic operations on digitized images of printed items, you can't help but wonder, what are we missing about block manufacturer from looking at their impressions? So here's a a surviving woodblock in the British Library from a Newcastle chapbook printer, John White and successor, which I'm showing in that kind of rather nice kind of variable lighting mode. This technology called RTI, reflectance transformation imaging, and it's good for revealing some material. I'll just replay that. Material features of the block, like tool marks, wood grain, and so forth. That, again, like the work of curating authority lists in libraries or training machine learning models constitutes something of an iceberg of invisible labor and of embodied history beneath the surface of the impression that's handed down to us through the surviving examples of impressions that we have, which testify to an industry about which we really still know very little. Okay, so everything I've shown more or less is available. The demo software, the data, and here are some of my contact details. I'm very happy to share any technical or other information about this research with anyone who is interested, and I'll put some of those links in the chat right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Giles. That was extremely interesting, and I'm sure we've got a few questions coming up already. Thank you to both speakers for some very interesting talks. Can I just ask a quick question of both speakers? Have you published what you've been talking about today, or are you planning to publish it anywhere? Just ask you both that, please, before we go on to the other questions.
Thank you, John, because I can announce that this week we published a technical paper in the HIP 21 workshop of the International Competition on Document Analysis and Recognition, which took place on Monday in Switzerland. So nowadays, most of the technical work in our field happens in conference and workshop proceedings. It's an open access publication, and I can send the link to that paper to anyone who's interested. There's also going to be a paper, I hope, near future on what I found out from the analysis.
That's great. Thank you for that, Giles. Could you send the link to me and I'll pass it on to HoPIN in the next HoPIN news? I'll put it in there if that's okay. Leo, have you published, or are you planning to publish?
Well, there's a paper I've written on the excuse me, on the midwinter metal cut illustrations with an editor at the moment, and I don't know what stage it's at, but it's written and it's there. I did, Giles, what was that thing we did at the English Folk Song and Dance Society?
I've got that somewhere.
Exactly what, but anyway, I wrote I gave a lecture and wrote a paper on my visit to McGill University in Montreal, Canada, who have a tremendous collection of woodblocks. And I spent a fortnight in the archive going through these woodblocks, and did actually, and it's gone completely out of my mind now what the title of my talk was, but it was to the English Folk Song and Dance Society a couple of years ago or last year. So there's one thing out there, there's one thing waiting to go out there, and I'm not certain whether I'll develop this talk further into a paper, but you know, one never knows.
Great, thanks very much, Leo. Right, let's go to the audience questions. There are quite a few questions for Giles, so can we have some questions for Leo as well, please, because we don't want him to be left out.
Oh no, Giles is terribly complicated and very,
well,
very interesting.
It's different, right? Giles, a question from Ad Steinman: is your system capable of identifying colours in prints, printed and hand-coloured, and or to classify colours?
So the device, the matching tool, ignores color, which is one of the reasons why it can find things at varying amounts of contrast. The classifier tool is strongly influenced by color. And that can be a problem if you're looking for features within monochrome images within larger, when you're trying to classify monochrome images within larger collections of paintings and things. So if you see a kind of a large overview of an art historical data set and people produce these massive visualizations of hundreds of thousands of paintings, they're often kind of banded by color. You can see how influential color is for the classifier. And it's up to it. These AI systems can absolutely draw their own. The reason they're powerful is that they come up with their own mechanisms for asserting similarities. So you find these kind of color groupings, and just often there's all the monochrome material together, and it's not successful at matching an object between color and monochrome very often, but you can attempt to test that. So there are ways of grouping things by color, but not in the tool chain we're using. And I'm just on the subject. I was looking beside me for Leo's excellent publication on the amazing collection of woodblocks at McGill, and I'm sure I've got it somewhere, but can't find it. But I have found the reference to the Ballad Partners website where it is to be published. So I'll put that in the chat to everybody.
Okay, thank you. Okay, another one for Giles here from Chantal Dollimore. Is the long-term aim of this trial that we get all the known chapbooks digitized from organizations and collectors for comparisons of illustrations? That sounds like a tall order, but is that the ultimate aim?
I mean, it's one of my ultimate aims. I'd love to see that happen. Interesting. I mean, chapbook collections are scattered, but a number of them have been digitized lately. So McGill, again, have a great website of digital images of their chapbooks. There's one or two others in Canada, so University of Guelph, South Carolina, partly because of the interest in Burns in chapbooks. Scottish chapbooks are quite well covered. And yeah, if you have all extant chapbooks digitized, there are other questions you can ask and attempt to answer than even they're possible with a large data set such as the NLS. So I'm interested, as I indicated, in tracing visual influence across between printers and makers, and also interested in the movement of blocks and phenomena such as the Newcastle chapbook industry, which is clearly serving a Scottish market, and some of whose blocks may have found their way into Scottish makers as well, their possession. So those kind of relationships, I think, you can only really view at scale.
Yeah, thanks, Giles. Question for Leo, at last, from Johan de Soto. What makes you think that some of those illustrations are metal cuts rather than stereotypes?
Well, can you hear me, by the way?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
I can,
yeah. Stereo, we're talking about 1740, and stereos aren't around.
No.
Ged has invented a stereo process, but it's really for type. It's not for illustration. I looked an awful lot for evidence, bibliographical evidence about interest in stereotyping or metal printing. Sorry, not metal printing, metal casting. And there was very little, but there was a constant reference to metal cutting. And it was seen as, in the 1740s, 1730s, 1740s, it was seen as a genuine competition with wood cutting. And, but there clearly was some sort of problem, because using type metal to cut would have been a lot cheaper than to use boxwood or pear wood or whatever, and it didn't last. So there must have been some sort of problem in the process that didn't allow it a longevity. But all the evidence refers to, and all the data refers to, metal cutting, not stereotyping or not pressing from metal blocks. It all refers to metal cutting. So on the balance of the evidence I found, that's why I've decided that I come down on the side that they are metal cuts.
Right. Thank you.
By the
Leo.
way, can I just give you the title of that article I wrote, and Giles has just referred to it. It was called Newcastle Chapbooks, Broadsides and Garlands, a study in the rare books and special collection library of McGill University, and it was printed in Printers, Peddlers, Sailors and Nuns, edited by Atkinson and Roud in 2020.
Yeah, that's a great book title, I think. I love
Yeah,
that.
isn't it?
Thanks very much, Leah. I had an announcement there. It's just disappeared. Here it is. Sue Allen asked me to mention about Leo's paper on the collection of wood blocks at McGill. There's also, oh, sorry, it's the same reference. Beg your pardon. Ballad Partners 2020. Yes, that's
Oh, good.
Okay. We've covered that. Yes, everybody's on the case, Leo. It's all right. Don't worry. There was a question which would follow up. Oh, where's it gone? There are a lot of questions. By the way, don't worry if your question doesn't get answered, because the speakers will see questions that we don't have time for and will answer them if they can in other ways. If we run out of time, we've got about 20 minutes, so I don't think we'll have a problem. I'm just trying to find, there was a question which I can't now see. I'm scrolling rapidly through about stereotype, which I was just going to put out of order because it follows up the last one, and now I can't find it. Perhaps it's disappeared. Wait a minute. No, it's disappeared. It was from James Mackenzie Hall, and I've forgotten what. Oh, here it is. Here it is. I've got it. No, I haven't.
I answered that, John, by typing.
Have you answered?
That, yeah, and that was James wants to reference, so it's there. It vanished, therefore.
Oh, right. Okay, that's why it's vanished. Sorry, I should keep my eye on the ball, shouldn't I? There are a lot of questions, so it's difficult to. I'm trying to share them out between the two speakers so as not to have any favoritism. Let's go back to them in order then. Graham Carlisle asks you, Giles. He says, great. For those of us with various scrapbooks of supposed Buick cuts, Buick in inverted commas, the software would maybe identify the source.
It would at least allow you to trace the adventures of a blog, although copies do change that. And the Buick situation is really interesting. And of course, Nigel Tattersall has done incredible amounts of work on this.
Yeah.
I would be interested in precisely those albums of Newcastle work that includes things like the Angus Trade Sale Catalogue, or the later Charnley and Dodds antiquarian catalogues of Newcastle blocks.
Yeah.
And those blocks in use in on ballads and chapbooks in Newcastle, other Newcastle publications. You've got a 70-year plus history of block usage, in some cases longer. I just found evidence of a John White block, a block used by John White in use in the 17th century. So certainly if you can establish those, if you like, lineages of a block usage, and maybe you'll get a chip or some other information that shows the degradation or condition of the block at a point in time, you can do some work on dating those. And that could be useful in attributing or de-attributing a Buick block, for example. I'm interested in thinking about, and this relates to more to sort of cutting than impressions, thinking about the influence of the requirements of chapbook block cutting for a hard-working block, for a kind of a durable surface, using an economy of cutting, economy of line cutting. And Leo and I have talked about this. I just wonder whether Buick is immersed in that world. He's done work for that world, and it's surrounding him as kind of one of the major trades that he grew up in. And I'm uncomfortable with the notion of Buick as a lone genius who emerges, kind of in his chrysalis, if you like, without any context. And I just wonder whether the requirements of making a durable block could have influenced his method. Quite how I get at that is a different question, but I have some idea. I'll stop there.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, but yeah, good luck with that. Okay, another question for Giles. Sorry, Leah, they're mostly for Giles. That's you don't mind. Yeah, question for Giles from Julia Thomas. Could it be that machine learning might actually suggest and challenge different classificatory definitions for illustrations? For example, what constitutes an ornament? Visually, it could reveal synergies between and across conventional types of image. Interesting.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, absolutely, I think. And with machine learning, you get what you give. But what you get back may suggest connections that you hadn't previously seen. And you could see this in some of the null results I showed and towards the end of my presentation. We had things that weren't ships, but that had a certain kind of quality of just diagonal lines, for example, that are not unlike sails. You can get that as well with, I think, kind of large corporate things that illustrations and ornaments, and you will see serendipitously things that you maybe didn't have a search term for explicitly, but the machine doesn't have that kind of semantic understanding. And the kind of often the scenario for that process is when you're attempting to fine-tune or to train out the thing that you don't want. So if, for example, I'm just rather relentlessly looking for Robinson Crusoe and telling the system, no, really these pictures, please, just only give me back things that look like this. Maybe it will throw back things that remain stubbornly visually similar. And I think the same is true in, say, ornamental, quote unquote, and illustrated, quote unquote, work, that you manifestly see things that have features that are in common with the thing that you had seen as a separate class.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Giles. A question for Leo from Chris Blumel. Yes, there is one for you, Leo. It's all right. Chris is interested in the idea of illustration as an indicator of popular folk, in inverted commas, people's literature, and to what extent people signal children versus adult readerships, or both. Leo spoke directly to boyish consumers of our friend Robinson. Do we know where these youth would have purchased these chapbooks and how patterns of purchase changed over time, for example, from peddlers or shops or stands? That's a big question. There's another whole talk in there, I think, Leo, for another time. But if you can find a brief answer to that, that would be good.
Yeah, well, can you hear me again?
Yes.
Well, I think the person who asked the question knows the answer. They were distributed through hawkers and peddlers. It's going to be interesting to be able to, what would be interesting rather, would be able to pinpoint when the chapbook Robinson Crusoe becomes most decidedly a children's book. At that point, one imagines these are books that are being purchased from booksellers rather than being distributed by peddlers and hawkers. You're likely to have the middle-class mum going into a bookshop and buying these chapbooks and Robinson Crusoe for the child, as opposed to waiting for someone knocking on the door and say, do you want to buy a booklet, lady? So that's one of my feelings about this. And the interesting thing is, for me, would be to know, is there a point at which one can say, okay, the chapbook Robinson Crusoe ceases to be a young male adult product and becomes definitely a children's product. Whether it's going to be a research through Newbery or Carnan, the publishers associated with children's literature, or not, I'm not sure, but that's one of the things in my final sentence of my talk about it. It would be an interesting thing to track down or track Robinson Crusoe through to the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. Might throw that sort of answer up.
Yeah.
What else was asked? I can't remember.
I think that's answered the question, really. Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Leo. It's an interesting topic and a big one, of course.
Yeah, a massive one.
Okay,
Yeah.
massive one. Let's move on to something else.
I
Question that may. Sorry, go on.
Can I add, John?
Yeah.
I've had to wade through an awful lot of text on reading and education, and that's not my interest. My interest is trying to get into the head of those who create the image, not those who use it, not those who are consuming the images, but those who are creating it. What were they thinking when they drew these images and cut these images? What are they responding to? What is the driving force in their creative process? That's what I'm primarily interested in.
Yes, thanks for clarifying. Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is a big and very interesting field, both consumption of these things and production and distribution and everything, really. I mean, it's a huge, potentially a huge field. Right, let's have another question. Maureen Bell asks a question which I think maybe either or both of you could answer, on whether there is a crossover between chapbook and ballad illustration. That's an interesting one. Leo, do you want to go first? Are there ballads of Robinson Crusoe or not really? Don't know of any.
Yes, well, I do, not ballads, but a garland, a song.
Oh yes,
later in the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century. Now, clearly, a lot of early 18th century chapbook imagery came from the ballads. They were once used as ballad illustrations and are now being applied to chapbooks. But this is in an indiscriminate way by printer publishers, using these blocks have come down to them, and in a very imaginative way often, they're using these blocks that were designed for a ballad with a specific song. They're taking these images and applying them to stories with greater or lesser success, really. I'll pass it over to Giles now. He can.
Yes, anything to add? Thanks, Leo. Giles, anything to add to that?
I think there's definitely continuities in terms of trade that in the earlier period, certainly chapbook publishers, printers are also ballad publishers and printers, and sometimes the blocks themselves move across. John White publishes broadsides and later garlands, and the same blocks are present on both chapbooks and the broadsides. The dices as well. So I think the trade is the chapbook and ballad trades are closely related. One thing I wonder, and I talked with David Atkinson about this a little bit, and I'd be interested in Leo's or other people's thoughts on this, is why it is that the garlands format for ballads seems to predominate in Northern England and Scotland. And they don't really have broadsides from the kind of mid third quarter of the 18th century on. The slip songs, yes, sort of narrow slip songs, but the garland, the chapbook format is really dominant, in Scotland more so actually earlier. Over the broadside.
That's interesting. I hadn't realised that. Yeah, fascinating. Okay, thanks both for that. I wasn't expecting this as a question from me here, from David Shaw, who asks, where have things got to with projects to build a union catalogue of English chapbooks? Well, very briefly, this goes back to when I chaired a chapbooks working group under the auspices of the Bibliographical Society a few years back now. And we had a plan to do a union catalogue of chapbooks held initially in English or British libraries. It relied on some funding from the Bibliographical Society, which wasn't forthcoming at the time, and it's kind of just petered out. As far as I'm aware, I mean, I'm not aware of, I've certainly not done any more work on it myself. I don't know if anybody else has or is planning to do anything on it. Does anybody want to add anything to that? Either of you aware of anything else going on? I think it's still a desirable development, but it needs some pretty mega funding. What we'd asked BibSoc to provide was funding for a sort of trial, a pilot project to show how it would work, but for various reasons, council decided not to fund it. So that kind of put the kibosh on that at that time.
I mean, I was part of that working party, and we
Yeah.
did some really
Yeah.
interesting and valuable scoping work on where chapbook collections are in the UK.
Yeah.
One of the things we stumbled over a bit is certainly major funding. It's hard to get major funding from a large academic funding funder like the AHRC for a cataloguing project. Yes, you can get funding for a digitization project or a digital research project.
Yeah.
But another important question, I think, is, do we need a standalone catalogue of chapbooks, or can we use existing bibliographical infrastructure, like the thing that was in the UK, formerly known as COPAC, and which is now known, I'm going to get this wrong, as the British something bibliographical knowledge base, something like that. So, you know, there is scope for the catalogue could exist, as it were. You know, that these things are catalogued.
Yeah.
Not always well catalogued, and that's why the Bibliographical Society and others, you know, saw the need for this, and they were generous in providing some initial funding to have some workshops. But the challenge is to kind of, I think, draw attention to collections that aren't so well known, particularly actually in public libraries. So academic libraries tend to have better descriptions they're holding of chapbook holdings, and some public libraries have really important collections, big civic libraries and things. And we wanted to, I think it's still a kind of
a long-term aim, maybe. Yeah. And the other problem is that there are, in some libraries of various kinds, there are boxes of chapbooks, or a drawer full of chapbooks or something, which are not itemized in any catalogue. So getting somebody to do some work on that and actually list what's there would be extremely useful. I'm sure there are lots of treasures hidden away in libraries, and we just don't, we're not able to get at them. Okay, let's go back to, we've got about 5 minutes left for a few more questions. We're not going to get through them all, I don't think. Lots of people are sending messages saying, got to rush now, but thanks both for a great pair of talks. Question for Giles from Andrea Cavelti. Did any of your adventures include music?
Not for this research. I have worked on ballad digitization projects, particularly Bodleian Ballads Online, that did some work on to publicize the musical content of chapbooks. But I would love to certainly do some work on chapbook texts, and the NLS data set, like I say, includes OCR text. There was a great bit of research that Sean Graham did in topic modeling that text, in other words, doing equivalent actually of the kind of visual classification search I did to find kind of textual motifs rather than visual motifs, which he then turned into sound. And that was a kind of nice work, considering the important musical contents within many chapbooks. I mean, chapbooks are, they may be prose, they may be verse, and they do have this visual dimension, which I think, you know, as someone who's done lots of work on ballads, and Steve Roud, who's here, has spoken eloquently about this. If you're interested in ballads, you have to be interested in everything: the music, the text, the illustrations, and the production history. You know, these things come together. And so, you know, for the, I think there has been some, now we can see these things because they are digitized, and that brings up the possibility of doing large scale work such as I do, but also I think kind of Leo's work on, you know, extremely rare titles very often, you know, is sort of much more, it's just much more possible than it used to be. And of course we can share that work using forums such as HoPIN network visually, and make arguments we weren't otherwise able to.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, great. Okay, question from Caroline Archer for you, Giles. Really interesting talk. Have you been able to make even a cursory analysis of the RTI images? Were you able to discern anything of the sides of the engravings rather than simply the face? Are you able to see and make any sort of sense of the tool marks that created the image?
Yeah, I've kind of rather been keeping it cursory, Caroline, just because I'm so kind of transfixed by the ability to just, you know, kind of turn over this image of a block as if it was in your hands. And I think that's the really appealingly intuitive thing about RTI, because as you've got, if I can explain for us, you've got a block here which you put in a lighting dome, and take pictures of it from multiple angles. And that allows you to pan it, as I showed, so you can see it from different angles. And that just is kind of very good for looking. It's not so good for the kind of forensic analysis of tool marks we showed. I mean, you can see things, but if you're looking to measure, it's not ideal. For that, you want something like 3D laser scanning or photogrammetry. And Michael Hancher has done some really nice visualizations of 3D, full 3D, so not just the face, but 360 all around the object. And you can pan them and spin them. Of number of blocks at University of Minnesota Library, so Buick blocks and other blocks. I would be interested in doing that specifically to get to, like, tool marks interest me.
Okay, we're going to have to make this the last question. There are about half a dozen questions we haven't managed to get to, so apologies to those who've asked questions that haven't been answered, but we'll try and answer them in other ways, email or something later. The last one then from Karen Reed well, it could be for both of you, I guess, actually. Do chapbook illustrations cross over to map ornaments or vice versa? What digital tools could be used to approach the question? Does anyone have such a project underway? It's probably more Giles, actually, but if,
so if there are any features in chapbooks, I suppose it depends how your map is made, really. But if it's a letterpress map that includes and that map is present elsewhere, or if the map is a composite of multiple blocks, which I think is pretty unusual, then you can find those using the Vice tool that I showed. If there are visual motifs across both chapbook illustrations and maps, then that are copied freehand, so realized differently on different printing surfaces, then you can potentially try to trace those. I think I'd probably have to see, perhaps we can correspond about this, Karen. I have to see some examples before I could say what could be matched. But part of your follow-up question, I don't know anyone has such a project underway, but I will say that there's a really active community of people doing computer vision on maps to extract features like, well, everything that maps contain, rivers, settlements, and so forth, or the contours of a landscape. And you may want to kind of come to an assessment about the accuracy of that rendition, or you might want to trace how that landscape has been depicted over time, or even changed over time. So this is done when people are studying coastal erosion and things. Yeah,
great. Thanks very much. Well, thanks to both of you for answering all those questions, especially Giles, who had the lion's share, the unfair lion's share of the questions. Okay, thank you for that. That pretty much concludes things. I'm going to hand back to Claire in just a second. Can I just mention, HoPIN, the History of the Printed Image Network, is almost a year old. It'll be a year old next month. We have 300 members now, so thank you to all of those. If you're not a member and would like to join, I've just put my email address in the chat section. So just email me. There's no charge for joining, no charge for events, but if you get on the mailing list, you will get details of forthcoming events. Next events in November, details to be all arranged and announced shortly. So yeah, that's about it. Thanks again to Leo, to Giles, and to the University of Wolverhampton, to Claire and Elena and their team for hosting us once again very skillfully and successfully for another excellent HoPIN webinar. Thanks very much, everyone. Over to you, Claire.
Thanks, John. For everyone who's posted questions and we weren't able to answer them this evening, I will get a copy of those over to John, Leo and Giles, and we can answer those at a later date at their leisure. So we'll certainly get that sorted for you. Thank you, Leo and Giles, for wonderful presentations, and thank you to John, as always, for chairing the session. Please do keep up to date with our forthcoming HoPIN events via our web pages. Our next ArtsFest Online event is Wednesday, the 20th of October, with designer maker Lindsay Harris. This is the first of our Creative Future series, where our artists, makers and designers share insider knowledge on forging a creative career. As always, you can book for free through Eventbrite. So thanks very much for watching. Hope to see you at another one and have a good evening.